Welcome to A Place for Film, the IU Cinema podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking about Nicholas Ray. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And on this week's episode, we've got Will Scheibel back with us to talk about his obsession, I think, Nicholas Ray. Thanks for joining us, Will.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So there's going to be a Nicholas Ray series at the cinema over the basically once a week for the next 4 weeks. And we're going to talk about that today. All right. Well, let's talk about Nicholas Ray. And we've talked about Nicholas Ray on this podcast before with you, Will. But maybe we can sort of reintroduce both Nicholas Ray as a director and your qualifications to speak about Nicholas Ray.
Absolutely. My interest in Nicholas Ray is based on my dissertation. I'm for those of you that don't know, I'm a PhD candidate in Film and Media Studies in the Department of Communication and Culture, and my dissertation is a reputation study of Nicholas Ray. And I have a forthcoming book coming out hopefully in December, if all goes well. And it's an edited collection that I put together with my friend Stephen Rybin, and it's called Going Home: New Essays on Nicholas Ray in Cinema Culture. It's being put out by SUNY Press. And Nicholas Ray was active primarily, his commercial period was primarily during the 1950s. It sort of begins in 1948 and it ends around 1963. And then after that, he was doing experimental sorts of work overseas in Europe. And then he comes back to the U.S. to make one of the films that we're going to be seeing at the IU Cinema called We Can't Go Home Again. So he's a post-war Hollywood director, and he is known for his work in film noir, In a Lonely Place, which is one of the films on the program, They Live by Night, and On Dangerous Ground. All three of those films would be categorized as film noir, which is another topic that's near and dear to my heart, as listeners from the show might remember. And Rebel Without a Cause is by far his most famous film. It's not a film noir, but it is his most popular film today, even outside of kind of cinephile circles. And I think it's probably best remembered for James Dean's performance as the juvenile delinquent Jim Stark. And so that's kind of who Nick Ray is broadly, and we can kind of get into more detail if you guys want. But that's kind of my investment.
Yeah. You also programmed this series.
I did, yes.
You did. So how did you – I mean, we've got 4 films here. How many films did you give John to sort of say, here's my dream list, and did he have to pare it down or what?
He wisely set the number for me. Okay. And I would say that if people don't really have much familiarity with Nick Ray – beyond maybe Rebel Without a Cause, these are the films to start with. And I think when I was on the podcast, I think that was the first time I came on the show, was to talk about Nick Ray. I think these were the films actually that I mentioned without We Can't Go Home Again. But if people like what they see at the IU Cinema and would like to explore his career more, I would highly recommend Johnny Guitar, which had there been room for one more film on this program, I absolutely would have put Johnny Guitar on there. And there are various reasons why I wound up sticking with the ones that I did. I was going back and forth in my head for a while about this. Johnny Guitar is a Western, a very, very offbeat Western with Joan Crawford and Sterling Hayden. And it's oftentimes read as an allegory for the HUAC era in the 1950s. And it's something that feminist critics are also particularly interested in because unlike most Hollywood Westerns, the protagonist is a woman. And another film I would highly recommend beyond the 4 that are on the program here is a film that the Criterion Collection put out within the last couple of years, and it's called Bigger Than Life, and that's a suburban melodrama, domestic melodrama from 1956 starring James Mason, and he plays a cortisone-addicted school teacher that brings a reign of terror on his suburban family at home.
I'm in.
Yeah,
done.
I heard more do you need to know?
Cortisone addicted school teacher. And I'm done.
Widescreen, vibrant colors.
Yeah,
it's melodrama to the max. So.
Excellent. So let's talk about the 4 films that are in here, and we'll just go through them one by one here. The first one is They Live by Night, and this is the one out of these 4 that I am least familiar with. Okay. So this one's going to be on Sunday, January 27th at 3 p.m. Basically, starting this Sunday, be at the cinema every Sunday at 3 p.m. and you can see another Nick Ray movie until the middle of February. So, They Live by Night. What can you tell me about this one?
Well, one of the main reasons I wanted to have this on the program is the first movie I definitely wanted to get on the program was We Can't Go Home Again. And we'll talk about that in a little bit because that's the last one on the schedule. But I thought if we're going to show his last film, we should probably show his very first film so we can see where he started and where he ended. And there are a lot of resonances with Rebel Without a Cause. They Live by Night and Rebel Without a Cause. They're both about young delinquent figures. And They Live by Night is my personal favorite of the Nick Ray movies. So I had, I guess, maybe some selfish reasons for wanting to put that on there. And, you know, as movie buffs, you guys probably get asked a lot, what's your favorite movie of all time? And it's probably difficult to pick one, or maybe it's always changing.
Not for me.
Not for you? Okay.
I got one.
Okay. Well, for me, it's difficult. It changes periodically. But the one that I guess most recently has been in circulation for me with the title that I identify as my favorite movie is They Live by Night. This is a great introduction to Ray beyond it being his first film. I think it's a good one to start with because it introduces a lot of Ray's central themes. It's about young people, delinquents, outlaws, outcasts. He's very interested in the figure of the loner, the figure of the rebel, people that are on the fringes of society and social norms. And this is a film about an outlaw couple. So they're both criminals, the protagonists in the film. Farley Granger and Kathy O'Donnell play the two anti-heroes in this movie. And they're trying to kind of leave that life of crime behind them and actually have a life like regular people. But of course they can't, as the crime genre always tells us. You can't escape your past. You have to pay for your sins somehow. And so they go on the road to try to escape not only their criminal past, but the law. The law is after them as well. And it's about how they are always attempting to sort of carve out some kind of stable home in post-war America and yet are always uprooted at the same time. And this is a movie that along with other movies from the same period like Gun Crazy and actually an older film that Fritz Lang directed from the late 30s called You Only Live Once. This is a part of the subgenre of the crime movie called the outlaw couple film. And French critics would refer to this as and I don't speak French, but I think the pronunciation is amour fou. And that formula is probably more familiar to mainstream audiences in movies like Bonnie and Clyde or True Romance or Wild at Heart, something like that. Badlands, the Terrence Malick film. Well, They Live by Night is an early example of this kind of film. So I thought that formula would be recognizable to people, and that might interest them in this. And it's a beautiful movie. It's gorgeous. It's, as the description says, it's very dreamlike. It's very haunting. And it's unique. I feel like Ray never really quite captured that style again in his career. Not that I think he tried to, because his films are different as he moved along. But it's a very poignant film. And it's very much the kind of American pastoral sort of images. So if you like Terrence Malick, it's not a Malickian film, but it has elements of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you use the word Malickian. As I've gotten more into film over the past couple of years, I've started to recognize that there's almost a genre of just people who just try to do Terrence Malick.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fascinating.
The Assassination of Jesse James is the best movie that Terrence Malick didn't make.
Yeah. Well, there was a film we saw at a film festival a couple years ago, Just Plus Moss, which had so many of these shots of just people walking through fields and just farm equipment just out in it was very, very Malickian. Anyways, the next one up here is In a Lonely Place. This is the one that I'm looking forward to most personally. This is probably one of the top 3 films on the cinema schedule for me just to see, because I've been wanting to see this movie for years. It's got Humphrey Bogart. I love Humphrey Bogart. Just for whatever reason, I've looked for this on Netflix. I've looked for I don't want to buy just any DVD. I want a nice DVD, and I haven't really found a nice DVD of it. And anyways, that's just me making excuses. I could watch it if I wanted to.
Well, you would buy it; it would just sit on your shelf. So
Exactly.
that would be the other excuse.
Just buy it and say, I've owned it for 20 years, and I can't watch it. But no, so tell me about In a Lonely Place.
Well, this is one of the most canonical of the four that I selected. Usually when critics kind of cite the 2 or 3 greatest movies that Nicholas Ray made, Rebel Without a Cause, of course, gets mentioned. Johnny Guitar comes up a lot, and In a Lonely Place comes up a lot. Humphrey Bogart is somebody that I'm almost as obsessed with as much as Nicholas Ray. And those of you that remember my appearance when we talked about Casablanca, you know, I'm a big Bogart fan. This is not your mother's Humphrey Bogart. I think I mentioned last time that in the 1940s, Bogart was moving away from his gangster persona and into, I think, what he's most remembered for today, which is the wartime romantic hero in movies like Casablanca and To Have and Have Not. In the 1950s, his star image undergoes yet another transformation, and he plays a psychopath in movies like In a Lonely Place, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which is late 40s, but let's just say post-war era. And In a Lonely Place is remembered for Bogart. It's also remembered because it's seen as one of Ray's most personal films, and that's another reason I wanted to select it. They Live by Night is also seen that way because it's a road movie, and Ray spent a lot of time on the road himself. One little tidbit that I'll probably mention in my introduction to They Live by Night is that between 1937 and 1939, Ray was on the road before he ever moved to Hollywood. He traveled the South, he traveled the Midwest, and he was working for the theatrical branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Resettlement Administration. And so They Live by Night speaks to Ray's experiences on the road and his fascination with American folk culture. In a Lonely Place speaks to Ray's cynicism about Hollywood, and at the same time his fascination with Hollywood. And I think a lot of cinephiles would say that we're both attracted to Hollywood, but kind of in a perverse way because we're also very cynical about it too. And In a Lonely Place stars Humphrey Bogart as a screenwriter named Dick Steele, who the film introduces him as this unstable person. He's prone to violent outbursts, and he has this kind of shady history. And then all of a sudden, very quickly, he winds up being accused of a murder. And we suspect that he's innocent. But then as the movie goes along, we start to suspect that he may be very capable of murder. So he may be innocent of this murder, but he's just as capable of committing a murder as you know any kind of villain in a film noir. And he falls in love with his neighbor in the film, played by Gloria Graham. Another reason this is a very personal film for Ray, he's cynical about Hollywood because he's somebody who was always struggling with producers and studio executives to articulate his personal vision that was sometimes, well, more often than not, kind of compromised in the end. Nick Ray was also married to Gloria Graham, and their marriage was falling apart at this time. And I think I mentioned the first time I was on the show that they got divorced in 1952, and I think the nail in the coffin of that relationship was when he caught Gloria Graham in bed with his 13-year-old son from a previous marriage. And so this is a film about a blossoming romance that gradually unravels and falls apart. In the late 40s and early 50s, divorces are on the rise. So this is not only about Nick Ray's own troubled marriage, but it, I think, speaks to that moment in American culture more broadly. The 1950s is also the era of HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And some people may remember from the first podcast that Nick Ray was a member of the Communist Party. He was also a member of various leftist organizations. But he was actually protected from the blacklist by Howard Hughes, who is the head of RKO. And nobody really knows exactly how Ray was able to kind of circumvent this moment when a lot of people's careers were ruined as a result of HUAC, where people in Hollywood were being investigated for ties to the Communist Party. But it was this moment of paranoia, I think probably one that Ray experienced to some degree. And so even though this film is not explicitly about HUAC, it's a very paranoid film, and it's about a very paranoid, dark moment in Hollywood when people's futures were very uncertain. And it speaks to that as well. The other thing that I think it speaks to, and a lot of film historians or film fans that are listening probably already know this, but 1948 was the year of the Paramount case, the famous Supreme Court decision that said that the current system of production, distribution, and exhibition of Hollywood films was violation of antitrust laws. So this changes the ways in which movies are produced, distributed, and exhibited.
We should explain. It used to be that the studios literally owned all of the movie theaters.
Exactly.
And so,
Exactly. And so this is the Supreme Court case that requires the studios to divest themselves of their theater chains. And this is the beginning of the era of what's called horizontal integration. It's also the beginning of an economic downturn in Hollywood. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of the industry. There's a lot of paranoia about one's reputation, one's career because of HUAC. And there's also this kind of moment of disillusionment when these hasty marriages that took place right before the war were starting to kind of fall apart after the war as people are returning home, and that perhaps that ideal is demystified after the war. And Nick Ray, his marriage is falling apart at this time as well. So this is very much a product of its time. And I would compare this film to, and a lot of other critics would too, to the great kind of Hollywood Babylon novels like F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Last Tycoon or Nathaniel West's The Day of the Locust. It's one of the great Hollywood stories about the dark side of Hollywood.
Yeah. I really can't wait to see it. The next one is probably the one that's everyone is familiar with. I've never seen it, but A Rebel Without a Cause. James Dean, one of his 3 films that he was in. Go for it.
This is indeed the one people remember Nick Ray for. I figured that the Indiana University Cinema has to give props to an Indiana boy like James Dean. And actually, the Indianapolis Museum just had an exhibit of James Dean's stuff. So I thought there'd be a lot of local interest for that. And it's an old favorite. And a lot of people, I think, like going to the cinema not always just to see new movies, but their favorite movies that they've always wanted to see on the big screen. And I saw a Blu-ray or not a Blu-ray, a DVD of Rebel Without a Cause when I was the TA for the Hollywood 2 class, and we had our screenings at the IU Cinema. But I've never seen a 35 millimeter print of Rebel Without a Cause on the big screen. So this will be my first time as well. And yeah, it's an iconic movie. It's iconic for James Dean largely. This is not only the movie that I think people remember Nick Ray for, it's the movie that people remember James Dean for, even though East of Eden and Giant are also classic Hollywood fare. And Dean plays a juvenile delinquent who moves to the suburbs with his family, and he's really kind of struggling with his parents, his relationship with his parents. He's also struggling with his relationship with his peers at school. And he's, once again, that kind of quintessential Nicholas Ray stranger who can't quite find a home, even literally in his own home. And so he kind of forms this surrogate family with one of the girls in the neighborhood played by Natalie Wood. And she's also struggling with her parents as well, involved with a local gang. And a kind of younger member of the school, played by Sal Mineo, the character Plato, who is coded as gay in the film and is seen in kind of popular histories as one of, if not the first, gay teenager in a Hollywood film. And it's about the sort of love triangle / surrogate family that forms as these kids try to make a life on their own. And I mean, it's stunning. It's a gorgeous movie if you've never seen it.
And they literally try to make like an abandoned house their home.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's a very interesting thing. Also, probably the best use of that planetarium.
Yes, exactly.
You see
the
it
Griffith Observatory. Yeah,
you see it in sort of so many different aspects, but it's just as soon as people see it, they're like, "Oh yeah, that's that one place from that one movie." It's like, well,
That's the movie,
this is the movie, yeah.
And actually, if viewers will remember to look carefully in the last shot, you see a kind of crane shot of the Griffith Observatory, and you see a lone figure walking up to the observatory and stops to sort of look at a plant or a flower. That's supposedly Nick Ray himself. And you can't quite make it out. It's just this kind of figure walking up to the observatory as the sun rises, and that's supposedly Nick Ray. But yeah, it's one of the great American movies. I mean, it's a film that really holds up and is as good as people say it is, I think.
Yeah. All right, so this last one sounds interesting.
Right.
From 2011, We Can't Go Home Again.
Yeah. This is going to be an interesting experience, and this is not going to be like Rebel Without a Cause. It's not a kind of beautiful Technicolor widescreen melodrama, nor is it a noir film, nor is it a Western. It's not going to look anything like any movie people will recognize. And this was, as I wrote in the description, this was Ray's final film. And after Ray left Hollywood in the 1960s, in the early 1960s. Well, after he stopped making commercial movies, because he left Hollywood a little bit earlier than that. His last Hollywood film was a movie called Party Girl in 1958 that he made for MGM. And then he does some international work, some co-productions in the early 60s. King of Kings is one, and 55 Days of Peking is another for independent producer Samuel Bronston. Then after that, he really kind of cuts his ties with Hollywood and is just doing experimental work in Europe. And there's a lot of abandoned projects at this time. He eventually comes back home. He eventually comes back to the U.S. in the 1970s and starts teaching film at SUNY Binghamton at Harper College. He's a professor of film there, film production. And he has a lot of radical theories about teaching film. And so he decides to make his last film with his students. It's an autobiographical film sort of about its own making. So it's both an experimental movie but also a kind of documentary about its own production. The students are all playing kind of fictionalized versions of themselves. He's playing a fictionalized version of himself. And as I mentioned here in the description, it's formally very innovative. In addition to his sort of innovative approaches to teaching film, this is formally quite unique. He projects multiple Super 8, 16 millimeter, and video images on a Profilmic screen and then refilms this. And this film was one he was tinkering with right up until his death in 1979, but a kind of quasi-finished version was released in 1973 at the Cannes Film Festival. The version that we're getting here at the cinema is the new restoration, the version that was restored digitally under the supervision of Susan Ray, Nick's widow, for his 2011 centenary celebration. And it played at the Venice Film Festival and a lot of other cinematheques. And so I'm really, really happy that we can see it here. It's going to be a very difficult film. It's a challenging film. It's a film unlike anything we've probably seen, but I think it's historically important and especially for people that are interested in Nick Ray, I think this is really the way to see something like We Can't Go Home Again is on the big screen with these multiple images. And so it says here, I guess John has confirmed this can be a 35 millimeter print.
Yeah.
And so it'll be an experience. I'll say that.
Well, I've watched a lot of the underground film stuff. I'm not a fan of this stuff, but I want to give it a shot.
Okay.
I've seen some pretty stuff that made me just want to die. So it cannot possibly be worse than the Andy Warhol films that I saw. It really can't be. I'm sorry.
Well, it is reminiscent, I think, of Warhol with the multiple projection.
Yeah.
But you might at least personally find it more interesting since it's not as static as Warhol's movies. Like that movie about Lupe Valdez where we're just watching her kind of slowly kill herself. It's not like
I watched Kiss, which is literally just video of people kissing for it seemed like 3 days. It really did seem like forever. And then,
of course, Empire.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that one, but I know what you're talking about, where they just shot the Empire State Building for
however long it was. 8 hours or something like that. This is a more dynamic film, so it's very much a film about its time, and it's very politically charged. So when I say it's difficult, I don't think people will be bored. I just think people might be struggling to find a coherent narrative, which is exactly, I think, what Ray wants, because he's really trying to push the boundaries of the medium at this point. He's trying to find a new language for cinema, and this is his swan song. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah. So what other kind of Nick Ray news is going on right now?
Well, one thing I definitely wanted to mention is the We Can't Go Home Again was part of the Nicholas Ray Centenary Project. And Susan was kind of in charge of these various activities and events that were going on in 2011 to commemorate his centenary. And it was not only the release of We Can't Go Home Again, but also a documentary about the making of We Can't Go Home Again called Don't Expect Too Much. And if people want to get this movie on DVD, We Can't Go Home Again was released just earlier. Well, actually just at the tail end of last November, on the Oscilloscope Laboratories DVD set, 2-disc set, and it comes with Don't Expect Too Much. So We Can't Go Home Again is in many ways a documentary about its own making. Don't expect too much as a documentary about this documentary. We're going to get a little less meta now, and there's a third film that Susan is planning for this centenary project, and I believe it's going to be the last film. It's also a documentary, and it's called Action, a Masterclass with Nick Ray. And what she's doing now is she's launching this campaign through Kickstarter to fund this film. And it's going to be edited from archival material. There's lots of fantastic archival material that actually the Harry Ransom Center at UT Austin now houses. This is also part of the centenary. It's one of the things that has encouraged people to go back and study Nick Ray. So there's archival material and also clips from Ray's own films. And this will be like basically taking a filmmaking class or an acting class from Nick Ray. That's the intention of this film. So it's both a document, a piece of film history that she wants to preserve, but it's also meant as a kind of teaching tool. Nick Ray taught filmmaking, he taught acting, so it's something that we can actually use for pedagogical purposes. And so she's asking for donations, and you can go if people are interested. If you know Nick Ray and you want to contribute to this, you can go to Kickstarter.com and search for Action Masterclass with Nicholas Ray. And you can donate however much you feel you would like to donate. And as a bonus incentive, there are rewards for pledgers. And this includes postcards, posters, books, DVDs, and items that belonged to Nick Ray, including the red jacket that he wears in We Can't Go Home Again.
I imagine that's probably a very high donation
tier. Yeah, that's like thousands of dollars. But if there are any maybe faculty members out there that would love to show off this red jacket at conferences,
well,
it's there.
There's is it David Francis who collects the?
Oh, the David Brad.
No. He's a Bloomington resident. He used to run like the BFI's video archives.
Yes.
Is that his name, David
speak.
Francis?
I don't remember his name.
He owns a lot of film memorabilia.
Okay.
He owns like hats that Jean Renoir wore.
Oh, really?
And that sort of thing. So yeah.
Okay.
That maybe it is. Maybe it will come to Bloomington. Who knows?
Yeah.
That could be interesting. But yeah. Anything else you want to throw in?
No, I just hope people enjoy the movies, and even if maybe some of the films aren't quite your cup of tea, I hope you find them interesting. And I can't think of a better way to spend a Sunday afternoon in February than watching Nick Ray. Yeah. So I'm really, really happy that John was generous enough to offer this to me. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we'll get out of here. Yeah. So thank you again, Will, for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Always great to have you on the show. And we'll get out of here. I'm Andy.
And I'm Jason.
This has been, and always will be, A Place for Film. A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.